So, schönen guten Morgen.
All right, good morning.
Und herzlich willkommen.
Good morning and welcome. Welcome to everyone. Also welcome to those who are not with us here in the room, but follow us via the live stream. It is wonderful that you have joined our conference. I'm very happy to have you all here. So many people, so many perspectives, languages, biographies. And I must confess, when I entered the room and looked around, I briefly thought, well, hopefully our cityscape will not be suffering. That's a statement of Chancellor Merz, who talked about this cityscape as being too diverse. And I thought when I had a closer look, no, that's not true. This room looks like a normal society should look like. Diverse, vivid, sometimes contradictory, but not too uniform, too bitter and entrenched. We're not here to change our cityscape today. We are here to make our cityscape more visible, to talk about participation, justice, and the reality of a society that for a long time has become plural. Although some party headquarters or talk shows on TV have not fully understood that plurality. Yes, it's true. Migration determines the way our cities like, and it's so good to have that. And don't be afraid. We are making sure that our cities become more diverse, more interesting, and more just. Diversity is not an aesthetic challenge. It's a democratic achievement. And so therefore, we have gathered here to realistically show how our society, our cityscapes look like. Not like some populists want our cities to be, but truly we are looking at a vivid democracy, a democracy that some populists don't like and they turn away from it. We came here to talk about migration, participation, and a sense of belonging. These are topics that do not destroy the beauty of our cityscapes. They explain, they deepen our cityscapes, and they make cityscapes more beautiful. Well, between open arms and closed borders, a decade of flight and arrival in Germany. That is the title of our expert conference today. So we would like to look back at 10 years of development. We'd like to look at what humanity, empathy, and solidarity can achieve. We'd like to talk about what is possible when empathy is stronger than fear. 2015 and 2022, two turning points in history that have shown what is possible when people have leadership, when people, administrations, municipalities can show what they really can do. Yes, there were many challenges, there were problems, and there were conflicts. But in spite of all of that, the majority of our society was very resilient in spite of the terror of a right-wing extremist and racist minority that always tries to use all the problems around us to get some political capital. Even representatives of democratic parties believe in those instigators, those right-wing instigators, every day, and we see it also during TV talk shows. But we do not only want to look back today, we'd like to learn from the experience of our last decade in order to shape our future, because the success of all those who have made the arrival of those looking for protection possible are not often recognized. We rather see a political and medial narrative that overemphasizes problems, doesn't talk about success, and does not talk enough about progress. Migration, as it seems, is something that people don't want to see as something successful. They rather stick to the narrative of being overtaxed and overburdened. But we would like to take a closer and more differentiated look. We must make sure that we overcome barriers and racism in order to develop our societies today and in the future. Today, we'd like to look back, but we also would like to take a look into the future. Thank you for coming here to share your knowledge, your experience, your visions here in this room and also far beyond Berlin. Some of you have traveled from far away. Some even came across the ocean in order to share their transatlantic perspectives with us.
All the way to share your knowledge and perspectives. We are truly happy to have you here with us. Vielen Dank. Und mehrere aktuelle Beiträge.
Thank you very much, and we are going to also give you more information about the topics we addressed during this conference on our migration policy portal Heimatkunde. Today we had many cooperation partners, the German Center for Integration and Migration Research, DeZIM,
Dr. Noa
Dr. Friederike Römer, Dr. Lukas Fuchs, Dr. Niklas Harder, and Dr. Elias Steinhilber represent this German Center for Integration and Migration Research. Thank you for your expertise, your advice, your support. I also would like to thank my colleagues of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, Andrea Meinecke, Lotte Schulz, and the event management team. Thank you for your wonderful support. I wish us all an inspiring, interesting conference full of interesting discussions, new findings, and productive networking. And now I would like to hand over to Dr. Noa. The floor is yours, Noa.
Danke, lieber Mekonnen.
Thank you, dear Mekonnen. Dear guests, I'm very happy to see so many of you here. Also, on behalf of the German Center for Integration and Migration Research, I would like to welcome you to our conference. Let me repeat again. The title of the conference is Between Open Arms and Closed Border, a Decade of Flight and Arrival in Germany. I'm very happy that you have gathered here in Berlin and have traveled from far away to join us here in Berlin. And it shows that this is a topic that we are still interested in. It's interesting from a personal, political, and societal perspective. For 7 years, our institute has focused on these issues because we do research about migration, integration, racism, discrimination, and we contribute to the development of a rational debate instead of an over-emotional and not always fact-based discussion. I'd like to cite a book that I found quite interesting. We are all migrants, a history of multicultural Germany. The book was published in 2019 in German. That's another history of the Germans. Plumper shows that migration has never been an exceptional fact. This was always part of German history. The ethno-nationalist identity was never a standard, a norm. It was always a short-lived political construct. True German identity, says Plumper, was always plural, different, and the present of many different people. Since we see discussions about closing borders and remigration, it was so good to read that book, to learn about all the diverse aspects of migration in Germany. It was also interesting to read about how normal it was to integrate into society. And that showed that Germany has always been a country of migration, always over centuries characterized by migration. When we look at the last decades, there were two different movements. In 2015, hundreds of thousands of people came from Syria. And the Chancellor of Germany, in an act of humanitarian acceptance, opened the borders. In 2022, once again, hundreds of thousands came from Ukraine, in particular women and children. When the Ukrainians arrived, some acceptance structure had already been closed down, but many municipalities could draw on their experience of 2015 and test new instruments. But there was a major difference. For Ukrainians, for the first time, the EU mass immigration directive came into force. That meant they had immediate protection and direct access to healthcare, schools, social support, and the labor market. Syrian refugees had to go through asylum procedures. Until 2015, this was pragmatically handled, and people were given a protection status. When we look at the last decade, we can say it was a decade where refugees were treated in different ways. There were some refugees who got liberal access to the labor market. Other refugees had a position that was worse. In 2015, existing regulation was used, and the asylum packages 1 and 2 included both liberalization and a tightening of the rules. At the same time, all refugees with a recognition status of over 50% received easy access to the labor market. And there were also good integration successes. 2/3 of the Syrian refugees that had come to Germany in 2015 have a job today. That shows that integration in the labor market can succeed and has succeeded. The Federal Office for Migration and Refugees in 2023 said that all naturalization into Germany were made by Syrians. They are the largest group of refugees that were naturalized. They see their future in Germany, and they integrate with responsibility in our societies. So language courses, labor market access are factors that make it possible to get integrated. When we look back, in spite of all the challenges, we can say the state, both on a federal, state and municipal level, has taken action, has created new participation instruments, especially when it comes to the labor market, which is crucial for successful integration. Here, humanitarian values coincide with national interests because we have a shortage of labor because of our own demographic situation. An aging society like the German one depends on immigration in order to secure prosperity, social participation. But we also compete with other Western governments, other states, as far as immigration is concerned. So the real question is not how to limit migration, but rather how to become an attractive country for immigration. It is about time we have different debates how we shape our life, how we see diversity as part of our identity, how we can stand up successfully against racism and discrimination, and how Germany can be interesting and attractive for everyone today and in the future. Today we have a conference where we'd like to look back at the time period between the culture of open arms and the new closed borders policy. We'd like to look at diversity not as an exception but as a normal component of our society. That means we have to analyze how integration, participation, and anti-discrimination can be successful, and where we still have structural and symbolical borders. Migration must no longer be seen as a conflict between the others and the Germans. We must see migration as part of a common and diverse entire community. And we have to talk about how we can shape our society. Political and societal participation must include the experience of everyone that have gone through migration, because migration history is a history of many people in the immigration country of Germany. Diversity is not a risk that needs to be mitigated. Diversity is typical for the way in which we live together today and will live together in the future. Today we'd like to look at a certain time span, and we like to look beyond that. Let's talk about not just a stock-taking exercise. Let's also talk about where do we want to be as a society in 10 years from now. Hopefully we will have a constructive, good debate. We will look at the things that have happened and the things that may and should happen. I would like to thank the Böll Foundation for their participation, their invitation, and hopefully we will have an interesting conference day. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Noa. Und an der Stelle möchte ich nicht viel Zeit verlieren.
I don't want to spend much time. I'd just like to hand over to Miriam Kamara. She will be our host today.
Sie ist Gründerin und
she is a founder and managing director of ACOMA, Bildung und Kultur. There she manages projects regarding empowerment, human rights, cultural and political education. And Miriam Kamara is also a speaker, a freelance speaker regarding topics pertaining to decolonial structures, migration, and everything that has to do with diversity and pluralism. Miriam, welcome to you.
Dankeschön.
Thank you, Mekonnen. Thank you, Noa. We've been friends for many years, and I'm very happy to be invited to this conference. You have already introduced me. At any rate, I can say everything I do always is focused on society. I critically assess society. I also look at the fringes to see who are the marginalized groups. And whatever I do, I always want to make sure that everything includes also those more marginalized groups of our population so that we can live together in solidarity and pluralism. Today's new moon, wonderful day for this conference. New moon always means let go the things that are not good for you and welcome the things that we need to shape a better today and tomorrow. This is what we plan to do in the course of this conference day. We are going to have discussions. We are also going to have workshops and poetry. There will be 2 time slots where we will hear poems and art. Poetry gives us access to many topics and gives us an opportunity to find answers. We have experts here today. We have people here that are focused on migration, marginalization, asylum policy. We have people from the academia, from the political groups and civil society, and we would like to have a discussion with civil society. Civil society is also important for active work. They are the heart of everything we do, because in society the things then happen that will shape policy. I attended the Biennale in Sao Paulo, Brazil, a couple of weeks ago, and the title of the Biennale was Humanity as a Practice. And for today's conference, I wish to have humanity as a practice. We would like to celebrate humanity as a social practice, as a political, economic, ecological and legal practice. And I also would like to welcome all of you. I'm very happy to have you here. And now, I would like to welcome our first guests. There are 2 things we have in common. Next year, both of us are going to turn 50. So maybe we'll have a celebration, a birthday party next year together. Beyond that, we are going to introduce you. Professor Oliver Jung is a professor for administrative law. He used to be the governing mayor of Goslar between 2011 to 2021. At the moment, he's once again focusing on administrative law. He's a professor focusing on municipal law at the Department for Administrative Science at the University of Applied Science in Harz. He studied in Marburg and Bayreuth. He wrote his PhD on the topic of the connexity principle in the Bavarian Constitution. Welcome to you. Welcome, Professor Oliver Jung.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction.
Diesem 17. Januar, also
Da werde ich 50, ja.
Yeah, well, I will turn 50 on the 17th of January, and that is something that I dread, and I cannot understand how you can simply make that remark.
Ja, das macht mich echt fertig, ja.
Well, yeah, it is quite dreadful.
Das Konnexitätsprinzip in der Bayerischen
So the
Verfassung.
principle of connexity in the Bavarian Constitution, that means translated, well, whoever
Das liest sich nicht so ganz.
orders, whatever they order, they will get. It is difficult. I wrote 378 pages without any pictures. There are still some copies available,
Es eignet sich richtig gut, wenn man abends nicht einschlafen kann.
and it is a good reading before going to sleep. Whoever suffers from insomnia, you don't have to drink a bottle of red wine. You can just read my PhD thesis, and I will gladly give you a copy.
Zunächst mal vielen herzlichen Dank für
First
diese
of all, thank
freundliche
you so
Einladung,
much for inviting me.
die mir tatsächlich geholfen hat.
This
Ich habe ganz viel
invitation
Freude entwickelt, auch bei
helped
der
me,
Vorbereitung, denn
and I had so much fun preparing this conference. For 4 years, it's been 4 years since I left the office of mayor.
in allen
Being a
Kommunen,
mayor
auch
in
Goslar.
Goslar was
Und
difficult,
es hat mir die Möglichkeit gegeben, tatsächlich da
and the
auch
entire
mal
topic of
kritisch
migration
und
was
ein bisschen
difficult. And
selbstkritisch Rückblick,
this conference
zu
gave me
halten.
the
Was haben wir da
opportunity
eigentlich
to
gemacht? Was habe ich
reflect on what
Aber jetzt nicht,
we did
um
in Goslar, what
es nur
I
einfach
did in my
so
office.
zu erzählen und die Zeit rumzukriegen,
And
sondern
I do not simply want to talk about it,
auch mit Ihnen
but
zu entwickeln,
rather
vielleicht dann auch später
also
noch
try to
mal
develop
Podium, was können wir vielleicht einfach auch
maybe
anders und besser
different strategies
Wo hapert's
jointly
konkret?
also later on in the panel
Und ich möchte
discussion
weg von
and
dem
look at
Thema,
what the
wie ist
issues
das
were.
abstrakt,
And I would like to move away from
gesamtgesellschaftliche Aufgabe und Verantwortung. Wir
topics
schaffen
like
das,
what
Standbild
is the society's responsibility, how to
konkret
shape
in
the
einer
face of
Gemeinde,
the
in
city.
einer
I would
Stadt,
rather talk
in Goslar.
in detail about what it looks like in practice in
Wir reden
Goslar, in a
Deutschland
city
ja,
that has
immer
50,000
sehr
inhabitants.
gerne auch über,
In Germany,
Ost-West, ja.
we like to talk about the east-west divide,
Mehr über kleine Kommunen, mittlere
but
Kommunen.
we should rather talk about municipalities, small and large municipalities, and focus on that because there are fundamental differences there. We need to talk about the structures and the municipal
Dominiert von Vertreterinnen und Vertretern.
administrative structures because they are not looked at in detail.
Ja, eine Vorbemerkung zum Thema.
Just a preliminary
wir
remark
schaffen
on
das. Da steht ja so ein bisschen über allem.
this so-called
Ich darf
sentence, "We will manage it"
vorwegnehmen
by
oder diese
Merkel.
Vorbemerkung
Wir
mal
schaffen das.
voranschütten, dass das Thema tatsächlich
This
nicht geschafft hat und nicht nur meine Frau,
is something
sondern
that
viele andere sagen auch,
I had to deal with.
wahrscheinlich wäre ich auch heute wieder als Oberbürgermeister von Ihnen eingeladen worden oder es würde die Veranstaltung
I believe that even if I were still mayor there
das Thema Flüchtlinge
in Goslar, I would have been invited today. In any
2015,
case,
2016 nicht mit dieser Wucht erlebt hätten. Man kann auch
I
anders
think-
formulieren, wenn ich zu dem Thema einfach gar nichts gesagt hätte.
I would have also been invited if I hadn't made clear statements on that topic of migration. During the next few minutes, I would like to explain the situation that we had in Goslar and why I said that we need to take a different approach to migration and refugees.
Aber möchte dann auch erklären,
So I would like to talk about that, but I also would like to explain why
nicht erreichen könnte. Hab
what
da
I pictured was not achievable,
konkrete Gründe zusammengefasst und möchte auch
and I gathered 10 very specific reasons for that and would like to make some personal remarks as well. I'm not sure who among you has visited Goslar before. Raise your hands. It is a beautiful city. Wow, so many
Das
people.
sind ja ganz wunderbar viele Menschen. Haben Sie einen Gruppenausflug gemacht oder waren Sie
Did you
da
take a
alleine?
group? Did you make a group excursion to the city,
Goslar hat tatsächlich
or did you go there on your own? Well, Goslar
mehrfach in den vergangenen
has been blessed
über 1000 Jahren
a few times, and it's more than 1,000 years history. It was quite a wealthy city, as part of the Hanse in medieval times, you can see that we have beautiful houses.
Und dann vor allem Glück gehabt im Zweiten Weltkrieg.
And it was also spared during the Second World War. Goslar was too small. Brunswick and Hildesheim are the largest cities, and of course Goslar would have also been a target of the bombs, but the war had already come to an end. So it was spared. If Goslar had been a little larger, Goslar probably wouldn't have received the protection of part of World Cultural Heritage that it did receive in 1992.
Irgendwann mal und vielleicht auch bis
It was a beautiful city, and it remained that until about 2011. However, then the people of Goslar were not satisfied anymore and voted my predecessor out of office. Until 1989, 1990, it was quite a quaint city. It was located on the border. Also, there was mining there until 1988, and the chemical industry was situated there.
Sind die Berliner unterwegs gewesen und haben Urlaub gemacht.
And people came on holidays there. And then in 1990, 1989, 1990,
kann man auch an der Einwohnerzahl ablesen.
There was still a boom until 1992. So people moved there, but then population decreased rapidly. The location of the Federal Army was removed from there. The entire region was not attractive to tourism anymore, because in other regions in other parts of the Harz, there were more attractive places. The industry moved away from that region, and thus population decreased rapidly. So about 600 people per year moved away from Goslar. And in a city that has 50,000 inhabitants, that does make a difference, and that was the reason why I was voted into office in 2011.
Und mein Ansatz war es dann zu sagen, wenn wir diesen
My approach was the following.
Bevölkerungsrückgang nicht stoppen,
If we cannot halt that immense decrease in population,
immer weiter runter,
the city will inevitably
wir haben diese Gedanken eben schon,
go down a spiral,
weil du Infrastruktur und Attraktivität immer weiter abbauen
because
musst.
infrastructure and other factors that make the cities attractive will decrease, because the infrastructure will be removed, such as education, institutions, schools, and healthcare. And if you remove that infrastructure further and further, then nobody will have reasons to move into the city.
Arbeit ist da, Betriebe sind da, wo Menschen gerne leben.
And my motto was always that we can only create jobs if we do have housing. And so I thought we need to take a different approach. We need to think about how to make the city attractive to people, to attract new inhabitants. And I said, if we cannot manage that, the city of Goslar will only be managed by a director of a museum. Goslar will become an open-air museum that is nice to visit on a Sunday afternoon, but it will not be a center of economy anymore.
Zu dem Thema Attraktivität und Diskurs und Vielfalt.
When it comes to attractiveness in a city, discourse, attractiveness in a city, my approach was that events are always part of that, and my idea was to annually invite two people to an event center to have discussions, controversial discussions.
Und im Jahr 2014
in 2014, Jürgen Trittin and Peter Gauweiler participated in such a discussion in Goslar, and that was quite a success. My task was not to give a speech, but rather to let to introduce the two and to welcome them,
ein aktuelles Thema im Rahmen dieser Veranstaltung angesprochen.
And to also approach a topic that is of relevance in those events. Well, you might say, Mr. Young, you were still quite naive. Well, I wasn't 50 at that time. I hadn't turned 50 yet. My approach was that we were doing something wrong. Take a look at that date. It was a year before Merkel said, we'll manage this. And even a year before, there were already tents and containers to house refugees in Hanover and other cities. And I already said that we have the wrong approach. We need to look at small and medium-sized cities, municipalities that can welcome refugees, where there are empty apartments that have a strong civil society that can contribute to finding solutions.
Das Thema Chancen viel stärker in den Blick nehmen und müssen.
And I already thought that we need to take a look at this entire issue as an opportunity.
Der Ansatz, was ich unterschätzt hatte, war, dass das
However, I had underestimated something,
und dann letztlich eine Art von
which was that the press had gotten that information, and then suddenly there was a hype.
Der das nicht nur alles negativ sieht.
Regional press outlets came to me and said, well, finally we have a mayor who sees the opportunities, who does not only see it as an issue.
Haben natürlich auch,
And of course,
ja, das ist klar. Jetzt muss ich glaube, ich war damals noch CSU-Mitglied, ich weiß es gar nicht mehr, oder
at the time I think I was part of the Christian Democratic Party, which I am still today. So people said, well, that person, he just wants to get some attention.
Nachgelegt inhaltlich, also es ist nicht bei diesen 3 oder 5 Minuten an dem Abend geblieben, sondern habe versucht, ganz konkrete.
Then I explained myself, and I wanted to make very specific suggestions. I
Ich habe dafür geworben,
suggested that we could become a model region, that we shouldn't change the Königsteiner key, however, that we could integrate and house refugees outside of the large cities. And I wasn't dreaming, because Göttingen had already implemented this strategy together with Hannover Gmünden, if I remember correctly. And I said that
von anderen Kommunen im Sinne von finanziellen Lasten übernehmen, aber ich glaube, dass wir in
I do not want to take a financial burden. However, I do believe that we can integrate migrants into our society in a much better way than they can in large cities. So when I prepared for this event, I, of course, also tried to find some older pictures, some that I have found. Of course, I do not have access to all of the pictures that are stored in the mayor's office. However, I found some pictures that I had stored on my computer, and I do believe, looking at these pictures, that we achieved quite a lot. We developed networks in the city. We built several models in the specific parts of the city and built networks there. To me, it was important to not solely rely on volunteers, however, to also create structures and create jobs. That isn't quite as easy as it is said, because I wasn't able to allocate the funds on my own. However, we were able to create jobs to support the volunteers in achieving this task. Some beautiful stories. I remembered Barat, a young boy
Töchter, also alle noch
who
schulpflichtig.
went then to kindergarten. I have 4 daughters who at the time were in kindergarten, and when I dropped them off at kindergarten, Barat was there as well. And when I saw him for the first time, he wasn't able to speak one word of German, and the mother wasn't able to do so either. And his brother, I believe he was 18 years old, a lot older than Barat, didn't speak a word of German either. And I could see for myself how he was progressing every day, and he learned more and more German every day. So Barat was someone I saw every day, and I could really see that the effort then pays off.
Also von dieser Zeitung Die Welt, die tollen Jungs von Goslar, das waren
Then we had the boys of Goslar, the pupils at the school there, whose story was also covered by the newspaper Die Welt. So they were also learned German quite quickly. And they were also integrated into the labor market later on.
Geschafft, ja. So, was wir nicht geschafft haben.
Something that we did not achieve. Well, Goslar achieved, was able to manage migration, was able to welcome the migrants.
Und das heißt, in Goslar ist es im Grunde so gelaufen wie in vielen anderen Städten auch. Viel Ehrenamt.
However, many volunteers, we relied heavily on volunteers as well, just as other municipalities did.
Und ich habe jetzt mal versucht mitzubringen,
what I tried to
die zentralen
summarize here today is what were the underlying reasons for me not achieving certain things.
Noch viel mehr kleine und Mittelstädte das so gemacht, wie ich mir das für Goslar vorgestellt habe.
Meaning that I didn't achieve to apply that model in that Goslar model on a larger scale.
Sondern
first of all, this wasn't an idea that the community in the city had. It was an idea that I had developed. However, we did not include the society, the community of the city in a process of participation in several discussions. However, it was an idea that I had and that I brought to the table during this event, meaning that I had no allies. I had no allies in the administrative branch because they said, well, what have you gotten up to now? And also not in the city council because I was not part of a group in the council. And so they met me with quite some resistance. And in the city's communities, well, I had some friends with the left party. However, apart from that, there were not many people who were so happy about my idea, meaning that I was quite alone in the beginning.
Eine kleine Stadtgesellschaft.
We do have a small community in Goslar, and they felt overwhelmed. There was so much media coverage, also on a federal level, in federal television.
Flüchtlinge braucht, weil hier ist alles dort.
The coverage was such that, well, migrants are needed in these small cities because otherwise they have no future. So that does something to the community because they are proud as well, and they like to contest. They say that, well, we do not have empty apartments. The city is not going to go down the drain. And what does it mean if there are so many migrants coming in? Will the rents rise? Will there still be spots for our children in kindergarten? And are there not other things that we should look at in Goslar? So this has something to do with the first reason that I mentioned, participation, how to include the community.
Stadtgesellschaft.
So I do believe that the community was overwhelmed at that point.
Thirdly, well, the media criticize the politicians. I can criticize the politicians because I'm no longer one of them. The local media, of course, was not helpful at all. Quite the opposite is true. Local newspapers did just one thing.
Die überregionalen Medien, die über Goslar geschrieben haben, zu berichten.
Repeated the things that were said by the national media. They repeated the things said by the national media about Goslar. They did not enter the discussion. They did not talk about why some things do work and why some things don't work. Of course, it is possible to dispute. It is possible to have a discussion, and I would never say that everything worked immediately well. All our efforts were immediately successful. But trying out things is important. We had no blueprint to follow.
Also deshalb spreche ich auch bis heute mit denen nicht.
And so that is why I'm no longer talking to the municipal rural media.
Keine Unterstützung von Kolleginnen und Kollegen aus
Got
der Kommune.
no support from our colleagues in the municipal family. Everybody has gone into hiding. The
Miltenberg, die Flüchtlinge
chief administrators from Miltenberg, they brought the refugees to Ms. Merkel in Berlin to show that integration doesn't work. And everybody said, well, Oliver, this is not a good topic for you to develop your political career. You have to be a bit more careful.
keine Kolleginnen, Kollegen, Bürgermeister
There was no mayor, no councillor who said, Oliver, that's a good idea. How can we develop that further? I also have some ideas. Nobody said that. Which meant as a mayor, you were left alone as far as this topic is concerned. And county administrator said, well, you are a mayor, but you are not the mayor of a standalone city. You are the mayor of a larger town that belongs to a district. You're not the only one to take decisions. You better be silent because I'm the chief administrator of that district and I'm going to have a say. Not you as the mayor. Of course, that this administrator came to my town and looked for housing. Well, that's of course clear.
Dann das Land Niedersachsen.
Then the federal state of Lower Saxony.
Da gibt es ja den aktuellen Bundesverteidigungsminister.
We have the federal minister of defense today who has no clear-cut idea about how to draft people to the army, but he is celebrated as the superstar, political superstar. And the Social Democrats would have won the last election had Boris Pistorius, our present Minister of Defense, been a candidate, would have run for chancellor. But he didn't want to do that. And in 2015, he didn't feel like talking to Goslar. He didn't feel like developing a model together with us to show that we can provide some support for the bigger cities. Let's try a pilot project. In Göttingen, some models are being developed. Let's roll that out to other towns. Let's develop a budget. Let's bundle our efforts and forces. He didn't do that. He just said,
Wenn du da so begeistert bist von
you know,
Flüchtlingen,
if you're so happy about the refugees, we are going to set up a reception center in Goslar, and now you can prove how to do that in a good way. There was an empty hotel in our town, and he found that hotel in Hahn-Klee. I mean, if you've ever been to Goslar, you might have gone to the municipal district of Hahn-Klee. There are 900 200 people living there, and it takes you half an hour to drive there by car. And there are just a few hotels. I mean, those smaller municipalities, they cannot handle everything independently. You need a certain size of an urban community. You need enough volunteers for integration to work in a meaningful way. I already talked about the fact that after German unification, the German army barracks were closed down, and also the Minister of the Interior went to the old barracks and said, well, we can have refugee centers, could develop something here in the former barracks. Finally, he didn't succeed in doing that, but had he succeeded, he might have the barracks today that we would need in order to replenish our army forces. And another problem that usually happens is everything takes too long. That's our problem.
Zeitverzögert aufgesetzt haben
and also,
ich habe eben schon mal gesagt,
well, the political
es gibt Zeltstädte und Container.
Organizations dragged their feet. They took decisions too slowly. There were 10 cities in the beginning, and 1 year later, the Chancellor said, we will manage to do that. Wir schaffen das. But 10 months or even 12 months had passed before that was finally said. In 2015, I already said we need more people working at the Federal Office for Migration and Refugees. They were talking and talking, but nobody ever increased the number of people working there in that federal office for migration and refugees. So there was a shortage of labor on that front. Those abstract talks in Berlin about cityscapes and whatever should be replaced by more meaningful decisions for local action. That is to say, municipalities must be given the opportunity and the resources to change things. Talking about cityscapes, I would want to make sure that we still have independent bakeries and butcher's shops. It would increase our cityscape indeed. And since we talked about the federal government and the slow decision-making procedures, you know, to have a federal country is a good thing. And I wouldn't want to do away with our federal structures. But a federal structure always has to make sure that our municipalities can work well. And a federal structure, in contrast to a central state like France, also has its weaknesses. And, I mean, we'd seen something like the weakness of our federal structure during the COVID period. It takes a long time to arrive at a decision. It takes longer in a federal state. I don't know, do you read Süddeutsche Zeitung? It's a national German newspaper. There was a report on a butcher from Würzburg in Bavaria. My mother lives in Würzburg, and that is why I was interested in that article. That butcher is Iranian. He was supposed to be deported 4 or 5 years when he was still an apprentice in a small butcher shop. And the whole village went to the district administration and said, this young man is our friend, we want him to stay. He stayed, and next to Würzburg Central Cathedral, he opened his own butcher shop, and he is a celebrity. I brought this photograph of that butcher because oftentimes our volunteers were disappointed, frustrated, because we had super integrated families and children, and all of a sudden they were still deported. And many volunteers, many entrepreneurs were really frustrated. They had done everything they could to integrate the people. And afterwards, when some people were deported, they said, I'm no longer going to volunteer. I'm no longer providing a job for refugees. This is a simple, unreflected reflex of the political structures, the so-called big parties, popular parties. They were not even able to stick together to arrive at a compromise when such a problem came. It did not concern the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, or the other parties used the refugee problem to attract voters and also create a discrepancy between the Berlin-based national government and the municipal structures. Oftentimes, district and municipal politicians just put the blame on Berlin, the central government. Now, coming back to our cities, our so-called cityscape, and the polarization of the people. After 2015, I have witnessed many demonstrations of some and counter-demonstration of other groups. I know my time is up, but allow me to mention a couple of more remarks. I was not the federal chancellor. I was a mayor in a small town of Goslar. I'd always been enthusiastic about municipal politics, and it was a pleasure for me to be the mayor. I enjoyed being that, and I was always very committed, as far as I can say. I wanted to do something with our city and our people. But then, if you get confronted with right-wing groups setting up demonstrations against you, publishing where you live, if you can't even use the main entrance to the city hall because of demonstrations, that has an effect on you. This is hatred. This is instigation. Of course, that decreases the attractiveness of such a public office. I felt it very personally. My family felt it. And even our house was attacked, not from a car from the main street, but massively. These people came from all sides, entering our gardens. And my wife said, I can no longer sleep here. We have to do something about the house. I'm not going to sleep here anymore without any protection. Of course, that has an effect on family life, and it also had an effect on me. It decreased, deplenished my energy, my power, and my willingness to be committed to municipal politics. Let me just briefly summarize, and Ms. Bendel, maybe you would like to join in then later on. We can say, yes, we were successful in Goslar. We are still being successful. And it's not just a topic for the town of Goslar. We have made so many things possible ever since 2014. But we did not do everything right everywhere. The open arms culture vanished very quickly. And the success of AfD, Alternative for Germany, the success of that party has something to do with migration. It is a party that tries to erode the confidence in policymakers. They say every day, those in power, they are not successful. They can't get it done. And that's what makes them successful. And in many areas, as far as our asylum and migration policy is concerned, we were not successful. And so this initial crisis regarding confidence in political structures turned into a fully fledged democracy crisis. We need more people working on a municipal and state level. We do not just need participation programs, rehabilitation programs for districts. We do not just need programs in order to modernize schools. We need more freedom for decision-making and implementation of decisions on a municipal level. That will bring success. Thank you for listening to me.
Vielen Dank, Professor.
Thank you, Professor Jung. We are going to welcome you back on stage during our panel discussion. It was an interesting journey to see your town of Goslar and to hear about the history of you being mayor there. I'm looking forward to the ideas that we are going to hear by Professor Dr. Petra Bendel. She comes from Friedrich-Alexander University. She's the head of the Migration, Escape and Integration Research Department. I'm not going to mention any years, but you got your PhD in 1996. That was the day when I passed my A-levels, and the Latin American party systems were the topic of your PhD thesis. At Friedrich-Alexander University, you are heading the research department for migration, escape, and integration. You carry out many practical research projects. You're also a founder of the Center for Human Rights, Erlangen. Welcome to you.
Jetzt haben Sie mir kurz den Schweiß auf die Stirn getrieben, dass
Well,
der Jahrgang.
I was afraid you would mention also my birthday, because I'm soon going to have my birthday. Dear Mr. Jung, allow me just to come back to some of the topics that you have addressed. The question of integration policy is the federal constitution, the distribution of resources, the distribution also of refugees to the individual municipalities. But I also would like to address not so much the question of welcome and integration, but also isolation, closing borders. And I'd like to come back to the current refugee policy. That is quite a lot for the 10-minute input statement that was given to me. And that is why I would like to also just mention a few basic facts for our discussion later on. The Commission, Germany as a country of immigrant, where Oliver Jung and I were members of at the time, called for better cooperation between the political levels and the different policy fields. In 2015, we had chaos in the beginning because there was a lack of coordination between the federal government, the states and the municipalities, and there was also a lack of coordination between the different policy levels, starting with the EU, going down to the municipal level. Today, emergency mechanisms work better. Social workers, volunteers, and full-time workers coordinate things better. That has decreased our random ad hoc decisions. In 2016-17, we called for an integration policy that enables refugees to participate in society as quickly as possible. That was right in the beginning. Integration services were to be opened as soon as possible, and coordination was to take place on all levels. As integration research tells us, that can only succeed if the allocation of refugees and local authorities is accurate, is good. And you said for the mayors and the district councillors, they were just left alone. Refugee groups were sent to them and were to be distributed. But then the refugee said, I don't want to go to this and that place. I've got family, I've got friends elsewhere in Germany. I would like to go there. So this distribution mechanism still is not a systematic one. Because, first of all, you need to take into account what the municipality can shoulder and what the refugees can accept. At Erlangen University, together with 4 federal states and over 20 municipalities, we have worked together in order to develop a tool for the refugee allocation. It's called Match-In. You may know this instrument. It's a tool that we've developed, and I'm going to explain. The Königstein financial resources mechanism remain as it is, and also the quota regulation is something we do not challenge, but we have developed a Match-In algorithm, and that can better match the individual needs of the refugees with the resources of the community, of the municipalities. That makes it possible to improve the integration potential, and participation and integration can improve. Secondary migration can be avoided, because if people feel all right at the place where they're allocated, they won't try to migrate to other regions of Germany. We have tested this mechanism in a number of federal states. It worked well, and we can roll it out to others as well, especially for the Ukrainian refugees. We also have developed a mechanism beyond that quota in order to distribute them across the country. For housing and food of refugees, most municipalities depend on fresh money coming from the federal states and the national government. We can no longer work the way we did in 2016-17. It's not just about an initial supply. It's about long-term integration, access to housing, language courses, healthcare centers, nurseries, and schools, and labor market. Many municipalities do have the potential to achieve all that, but they need flexible, reliable, and durable financing, and they need enough staff in the local authorities. So we must not let municipalities alone. Municipalities and federal states could even check whether reliable integration work can be guaranteed by making it a mandatory task of the municipalities, because that would then mean resources in terms of money would have to be allocated to them. Of course, that's the connexity principle. Professor, over 300 pages that you wrote, that's one aspect. We have published a study regarding integration as a municipal mandatory task. And we did not just advocate making it mandatory for municipalities to shoulder all these burdens, but they need to have enough resources, especially when money is scarce. Voluntary tasks of municipalities will have to be reduced. Individual participation depends on continuous efforts taken on the ground, taken in the municipalities. And municipalities really creates also cohesion and helps to set up a resilient and diverse overall community. How diverse and how resilient are we already? How polarized are we presently here? We can, as scientists, can rely on opinion polls. I think, Professor, you also quoted one opinion poll saying that 81% of the Germans see our society as being polarized and split. And of course, if you see your citizen only as opponents, then they say the main reason for that is immigration, climate protection, and the support for Ukraine. I'm quoting this data from the EDEM study. Hans Vorlanger in Dresden published this study in October this year. It's the so-called polarization barometer. And also the Human Rights Council of the United Nations said last year that in the United States and also in Germany and Europe in general, there are more and more efforts to sort of instigate hatred and also more and more hate-based offenses are being committed. Commissioner Turk said, political leadership based on human rights and a fact-based debate is the antidote to all of this. Human rights and a fact-based debate. Only in this way we can face the real challenges that people see in such areas as health, housing, employment, and social protection. End of quotation. So, if we have a polarized debate, like in asylum seekers and refugees, it is necessary now to look at the norms and standards, and we need to make a differentiated diagnosis and develop and promote evidence-based solutions. And that is the task of the academia, of think tanks and political foundations. In my experience, there is a definite need for a differentiation and reflection. We need to, once again, think about the human rights, the standards in terms of human rights that we have. And surveys prove me right. More and Coming in their publication of 2025, they've published an article saying, talking constructively, 5 questions for sustainable immigration society. I quote, there's a desire among population for a differentiated approach, and it was a large survey conducted among 4,400 respondents in Germany and across that also in Europe. We need no binary yes and no patterns. We need various aspects, coexistence, compassion, participation of all responsible institutions. And we also need to find convincing visions for the future of our immigration societies. Instead of that, we see trends
erhobenen Forderungen geradezu entgegenläufige
Tendenzen, quite contrary to what we've demanded in 1617. If we want to have a human rights-based foreign migration policy, we, of course, need also structures to promote the rights of those seeking protection in border regions. We are currently seeing an expansion of safe countries of origin and transit without the involvement of the Bundesrat. Despite concerns under international and European law, we are hearing ongoing discussions about determination the protection status of refugees in transit or third countries. We see a repatriation office that hardly ever mentions human rights, where the Commission calls for a so-called actively shaped refugee reception that creates security for those seeking protection, is better planned and more socially acceptable. We are seeing currently a refugee policy of rejections at the borders, also for asylum seekers. We see a policy that suspends the family reunification rights. They suspend the humanitarian admission programs and the resettlement for the most vulnerable. At all political levels, current discourse and legislation talks about a threat to existing international, regional, national and local protection norms and standards for people in need of protection. We see that access to protection is increasingly made more difficult. We see that with German support, people are being returned to countries where their lives and physical integrity is at risk. Here I'm talking about the Federal Reception Program for Afghanistan. But anyone who takes international and EU law and German constitution seriously and who wants to have a protection of the vulnerable must take a different approach. It is not enough, it is not admissible to abolish and undermine fundamental protection standards. Of course, rights are not a right in themselves, because rights can be granted or revoked, as we currently see also in migration research. Whether we want to do this, this is something we need to ask, because the legal standards were developed because of historical experience, and they should guide all our actions. And that means, what are the norms and standards and values that we would like to uphold and what course of action would result in that. And that talks about what we can do. First of all, we must provide better support to countries of first reception for refugees, and we must also monitor in how far they guard the rights. We must demand that violation of the laws in Europe and its borders be stopped and punished. We can use the facts, the clear-cut facts, instead of just vague terms such as irregular migration or even illegal migration, as our Minister of the Interior called it. We have to have a debate about illegal migration, but we can make the debate more rational instead of overly dramatic. If you have clear-cut figures and evidence basis, you would see that the situation oftentimes is very different, and also border controls are oftentimes classified as not being admissible. If we would like to protect the vulnerable, and that's the debate where oftentimes the right-wing forces say it's not the vulnerable that come to Germany, it's the strong young man. But if we want to really protect those in need of protection, we must focus on the most vulnerable and the most persecuted. But that also means we cannot withdraw the humanitarian reception and acceptance program. If we are honest, we must recognize that many of the fears that people have not to do with migration. It rather goes back to housing policy, healthcare policy, employment and social policy. We need to de-migrant or the debate. We must make sure that municipalities get reliable, ongoing support, are not being left alone in order to strengthen our social cohesion. All of us can make one thing clear. The right of the Geneva Convention on Refugees and the asylum law in Germany, given the history of persecution of Jews, injustice, persecution of minorities. We developed these policies particularly for this historical reason, and that is why we need to safeguard it. I would like to thank you.
Bleiben Sie ruhig. Wo Sie möchten, außer ganz außen.
You may sit where you want to.
Professor Dr. Petra Bendel. Nein.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Dr. Petra Bendel. This is where I am sitting. Well, you might take a seat in any other seat.
Wir haben jetzt das Panel und
we're going to have a panel discussion. And I am already emotionally involved, but also on a factual level. There is so much that we have gotten so much food for thought for our discussion, so please come on to the stage. Professor Dr. Oliver Jung, Engelhard Matzanke, and Karl Kopp. Let me welcome you to the stage.
So. Ich werde Sie beide nicht noch mal vorstellen.
I will not introduce the two of you. Again, I do believe that most people know who you are. They have already gotten a good idea of that. I will now introduce Karl Kopp. He is the co-managing director of Pro Asyl. He is a social scientist and has been working with the Office of the humanitarian organization Pro Asyl since 1992 in Frankfurt am Main. Since August of 23, he has been working as the co-managing director of Pro Asyl and also co-managing director of the working organization of Pro Asyl. There are many things that I could mention. However, I will maybe touch upon those things later on during our discussion. A very warm welcome from my side, Mr. Kopp.
Und last but not least haben wir
And last but not least, Engelhard Matzanke, Director of the Berlin Migration Authority, which used to be called the Berlin Foreigners Office. He studied law and worked at the Berlin Senate Administration for asylum law, and since 2012 he has been the Director of the Berlin Migration Authority. Welcome, Dr. Matzanke. I would like to start with you, Mr. Matzanke. You listened to the two contributions, and you are in an office that is characterized by policymaking. Is German asylum policy making aligned with humanitarian rights, human rights? What are your thoughts on that?
Also da würde ich einfach nur Ja zu sagen, ein bisschen Zeit zu
Yes.
Ihnen einen unmittelbaren
I would
Eindruck
like
zu
to
geben,
give
den
you
ich
a very clear answer and give you some insights.
Also insbesondere von Ihnen, Herrn Jung, vielleicht auch die Diskussion gleich
Dr. Jung,
ein bisschen in die Richtung zu befeuern.
your presentation gave me some insights as well. We are looking at the question of participation and flight after a decade of also discussion on borders. Borders also touch upon voluntary work and other things. Let me tell you about my stance, which might be contrary to your approach, Dr. Jung. We are still called the Foreigners Office de jure, but since 2001 we renamed the authority. There's a 69% of the refugees who are under 29 years old, and 34% above that.
Wir sind Teil der Berliner Stadtgesellschaft, aber wir sind nicht das.
A large part of our employees are women. However, we do not represent Berlin. Of course, when Goslar talks about Berlin, they talk about the federal level. However, we are a regional authority as well. We like to talk about ourselves as a migration authority, as we have done for some time, because we are a city of migration in a country of migration. We are the most attractive city when it comes to migration. However, we are also largely responsible for most deportations as well.
Herr Jung, ist, dass sich die Situation für uns
What came to mind, Dr. Jung, our situation was quite different than what you talked about.
Und da gab es ja damals dieses Schlagwort Lageso.
In 2015,
das Lea war nie das Lageso, und wir hatten auch keine Krise 15.
We had quite a different situation.
Unsere Lektion gelernt, und letzter Gedanke, über den ich
We did not experience a crisis. However, we had some learnings that we took from that time. In 2022,
die Zivilgesellschaft, Politik,
there was something quite surprising. Civil society and policymakers.
Und die ist komplett anders gelaufen. Die ist komplett anders gelaufen als 15.
Joined forces, and the entire situation with Ukrainian refugees was completely different than it was in 2015 with Syrian refugees. And I do believe that there are reasons for that. We need to talk about why in 2022 we had an entirely different picture than in 2016 and 15. And I do believe that there are several reasons for that. I do believe that we have the resources to welcome many people also on a short term. Quite quickly, we do need migration. Also from a humanitarian perspective, we do have that responsibility. But I do believe that we have the resources. In 2010, the city of Berlin had 3.2 million inhabitants, and 3 million of those had a German passport. We have more inhabitants now, however, still have 3 million inhabitants inhabitants that have a German passport. We will welcome more than 40,000 people this year, and they wouldn't even be able to fit in the Olympia Stadium. There are so many people without a German passport in the city. 200,000, however, were welcomed and integrated because of humanitarian reasons. So this city, this country said out for humanitarian reasons to welcome these people. I do believe that we can be proud of that. So I would like to answer your question with a very clear yes. Mr. Kopp, I would also like to give you the opportunity to react. You work in a different institution. Pro Asyl, of course, is an organization that is very critical. What are your thoughts on what you have just heard? Our name says it all, Pro Asyl. We are an organization helping asylum seekers when there are breaches of human rights. We help with refugees. So we are not a very traditional migration organization. The Summer of Solidarity in 2015 was a turning point. It was an event for us to rejoice, and even 10 years after that, we are still happy that there are so many people who made it, many refugees who made it. Of course, there were restrictions, legal restrictions, in the past 10 years. And however, many refugees made it, and we have a civil society who, that in 2020, but also in 2022, but also in 2015, largely contributed to this success. Of course, in 2022, within 10 months, we had about 1 million people coming. That is a challenge. And with the right framework conditions, but especially with the structure that was already in place that had survived the time of 2015, we were able to achieve this. And that is something that we would like to honor as well. In these times, it is important to underline that because it is often forgotten. If you had asked me that question in 2022, 23, if you would have asked me that question about human rights, I would have said that Germany is still important as a country to welcome refugees. I would have said that back then. Asking me now, I take a little bit of a different approach because we are focusing on restriction, on isolation, and today the situation is different. Germany, Europe, and also looking at the United States.
Das, was Petra Bendel jetzt gerade beschrieben hat, das zentrale Errungenschaften, die Antworten der Zivilisation auf die Barbarei, heute zu Disposition stehen.
That have been made are up for debate.
Gibt es einen Diskurs hier öffentlich, der sagt, okay,
the public discourse focuses on the laws that are might be a little annoying. They need to be changed. The Geneva Convention, the European Human Rights Convention, Anti-Torture Convention, all of these conventions are up for debate. Which is why we have to ask ourselves several questions. We have a strong civil society. Our society is a society of migration, so we do have tools for resistance. But there are policymakers in Germany as well who do not follow Merkel's line, however, who are more in line with the Tea Party and imitating the Tea Party. So we need to take a close look at what is being destroyed and how far democracy and the rule of law are under attack.
Ja, ich denke, die Zivilgesellschaft, auch Leute, die eine Struktur gebaut haben,
civil society, people who have built that structure will continue to play a large role when it comes to defending several principles. And at the end of the day, we are looking at democracy, of the rule of law, at human dignity, participation. These are the pillars of success. Those aspects, humanitarianism, human rights, are now more under attack and more up for debate than what we have seen in the past 10 years. And these are challenges that go beyond the sector of asylum.
Frau Dr. Bendel, ich möchte gerne noch mal zu Ihnen kommen. Sie haben das
Dr. Bendel, going back to you, you also described that asylum policymaking is characterized by doing away with protection, is characterized by pushbacks.
Heute eine andere Situation ist als vor 10 Jahren.
And what we've just heard is that the situation today is different than 10 years ago. I would like to ask you in how far German policy making in the sector of asylum is in line with a global policy. Are we adapting? Are we hesitant to take specific steps, and how are we influenced by global policy? Well, German policy here, of course, is characterized by European law, and in the past year, the European Union, the Parliament, agreed on a reform of the common asylum policy. Of course, that is not something that was imposed by Brussels, however, also characterized by Germany on one hand. On the other hand, it needs to be implemented into national law. On the 9th of October, the German Bundestag debated on the 2 proposals, implementation proposals, and let me talk about the GEAS, the Common European Asylum System. GEAS, or SEAS in English, in my opinion, crosses red lines when it comes to human law, human rights, especially where there's talk about having asylum procedures taking place on Europe's outer borders. The goal is to have those procedures take place on the borders, and as many of those as possible.
Menschen kommen an die Grenze, reisen ein.
So what this means is that people arrive at the borders, let's say in Greece, however, they have not officially entered the territory. This is fictional, and it is a tool in order to say, well, they have not entered Greek territory. They are not allowed to enter the territory, and they need to be pushed back as quickly as possible. And that is applied to several countries, countries of origin, where there is a protection quota of less than 20% who need to remain in those centers. And that comes close to prisons, these centers. This is a red line, one of the first red lines that, in my opinion, have been crossed. However, this gets worse because it has been agreed that children can be taken into custody without any type of regulation there. Of course, the former federal government has tried to prevent that. The European Parliament used to say, well, let's at least have an agreement that children under 12 cannot be taken into custody. Well, what does that mean? There was a debate on that, about the age of the children. The Parliament wasn't able to get that through, which means that children, regardless of their age, can now be taken into custody. And that, of course, I believe that is contrary to any type of children's rights, to any type of protection of children. I see UNICEF is also present here. And all of the conventions apply these rights to all children, also to refugee children. I could go on and on. With regards to procedural law, if I am deported into any type of third country from such a center, can I call? Can I have legal assistance? How do I contact that legal assistance? How am I informed about my rights? So there are many questions that we need to ask ourselves. Now the federal government has proposed the implementation law, and they did not try to step back and sort of mitigate these laws. The German Institute for Human Rights has analyzed the proposal and has come to the conclusion that this proposal only worsens the conditions, especially for the detention centers. Because you asked me about the international context and the implementation of into German law, and I would like to ask myself, how can they simply achieve that, and why are we not talking about this?
Herr Matzanke möchte reagieren.
Mr. Matzanke would like to say something about that.
Ich habe meine Karriere begonnen in der Senatsverwaltung für Inneres im Jahre 1994.
I started my career in the Senate administration in Berlin for the Interior. In 1994,
Abschiebungen nur aus Berlin.
I was responsible for 4,250 pushbacks and deportations from Berlin.
Mit so roundabout 420 Haftplätzen für Frauen. Familien, allerdings.
We had a detention center for the politically detained from the German Democratic Republic.
Mit Durchschnitten von 7-8 Monaten, allerdings.
We used to have the people in that detention center for around about 7 to 8 months.
Wir haben damals wesentlich zurückgeführt.
Back then, those deported were usually deported to Poland, to Spain, to Romania, to Bulgaria.
Und wir haben das zurückgeführt oder Menschen
via
zurückgeführt, die man heute als Fachkräfte bezeichnen würde. Also
and we deported those who today would be described as skilled workers.
Sondern ich würde ganz gerne
I'm not saying this because I am proud of that. I just wanted to take a look back and retrospectively. We were a democracy back then, and I would like to talk about what we have today. There will be about 10 spots in that detention center in Berlin soon. We had deportations taking place, usually from people who were free. We did not go into institutions, into kindergartens, into other accommodation centers. We are taking a humanitarian approach. The issue, however, and I believe that it's not being talked about enough, is a different issue, and which is why I am talking about 2015 and 16, and also the refugees that came to Germany after the Yugoslav war.
Und wenn Sie sich dieses Thema anschauen, dann werden Sie feststellen,
What is different now? Well, we do not have the capacity as a federal state.
Für 28 Tage vollziehen. Es geht nicht länger als für 3 Tage.
We cannot have the people for more longer than 3 days. There are about 800 spots in detention centers in all of Germany, and that number is not increasing. I would like to talk about something else. Of course, yes, you can talk about that politically, but however, I believe that we have a success story. Those who came in 2015, 2016 are largely working now. More than 80% of those who came, 80% of men are now working. Most people who we naturalized here in Berlin are men. 200,000 people were welcomed. A third of the Ukrainians are working. Most of them are skilled workers. There are so many children who we welcomed. A Spiegel journalist asked me, well, Köln is not Berlin, but Berlin is not Germany. I believe that the situation in other cities in Wuppertal and in Goslar probably is a different one. However, if you would like to counter the current political debate, you need to talk about the past 10 years as a success story, because it is one. We are talking about better migration for skilled laborers, work and stay. This will not succeed. However, we need to make sure that those who are refugees in 2015, 2016 are now German citizens who are working in skilled positions. So if you do paint that narrative, you can counter the AfD, the far-right party. It is a success story, and we need to tell it as such.
Stellt euch mal alle polnischen und ukrainischen.
What I like to say is that imagine that we didn't have all of the Polish and Ukrainians skilled workers. Imagine if they were all gone. Do you think you would still be able to hire any? And imagine that there were no care workers. Those who are already here are actively working, and that is the story that I would like to hear about.
Ich würde sagen, dürfen auch Gleichzeitigkeiten bestehen.
There are also, of course, certain parallels. We have those narratives that you have mentioned, and we also need to tell the story of our asylum policy. And we also need to look at integration, and we need to analyze it in a more differentiated way. We need to also analyze the options, the opportunities that people have to get integrated. And of course, that is a multifaceted debate. Mr. Jung, you said in 2014 and 15,
Politik gemacht haben,
you were a policy maker.
Wenig zu der Zeit damals
at that time,
in Austausch gegangen sind, gemeinsam mit den Menschen, die in Goslar gelebt haben, die Politik zu machen. Und Sie haben gesagt, Sie
didn't talk to the people in Goslar enough, and you paid a price for that lack of discussion. You didn't get much support, and you got a lot of protest. When you look back at that period, and when you look at the present situation here, I'd like to come back to Mr. Türk, quoted by Ms. Bendel. Political leadership must be based on human rights. Is that possible? Can we have a policy that is always based on human rights, even though we have a crisis? Can we have a policy that really gathers all walks of life, all people in society? I do think it's possible. But we need places, and we need time to do all of that. And this is what I wanted to express in my statement. At that moment in time in the past, I did not succeed enough.
Sehr, sehr kurz dann auch in den Diskussionen. Ich meine, die schönen Geschichten, von denen
I mean, the beautiful narratives you talked about, I also tried to mention those positive stories. To go to the companies and tell the managers, the entrepreneurs, now imagine those people came to Goslar and now they are valuable members of society. Children go to school, parents work, and they also do sports or work as volunteers in their spare time. I mean, of course, such stories create acceptance, but we need a time frame, we need a space. But there will always be people who say, I don't want migration, I don't want refugees. And they must be willing and ready to open their ears and listen to us. And Ms. Bendel, you mentioned polarization in your statement. We lost a lot of people. And nowadays, you don't get access to them anymore. They just say everybody needs to be deported, and that's the end of that. It's an ongoing task, a permanent task for all of those who have political responsibility. As I said in my introductory statement, it has something to do with personal attitudes. Do I get elected because I have an attitude, a position, and the values I uphold? Or do I get elected because it's my super dream to become a politician? And I just want to be re-elected time and again. Yeah, you said participation needs time. But there is sometimes also the moment of crisis, an urgency. How much time do we have for participation in your situation? Could you have had the time to create a process that integrates everyone in societies, create a dialogue, and still act swiftly whenever needed? This is what we tried to do, at least partly. But I think we would have needed higher concentration, more attempts at organizing, coordinating. I mean, there's also this day-to-day business you have to come to terms with. And sometimes you do not just need to be academic, create a participatory process or whatever. Just ask people to come in for a discussion of all citizens, put a mic on the table, and then start the talk. In 2015, we had a success story. But even now, where the going gets tough, where there's such a lot of hatred, we need to keep telling the stories, the successful stories of refugees that came to become citizens of our country, members of our society. We also need to tell the success story of civil society, who has done a great job. All those success stories, both on a municipal, the local and regional level, they have something to do with a very vivid civil society that came to terms with many problems. There are processes everywhere, processes you can acknowledge and talk about. I was with my wonderful colleague Helen Liseno on Lesbos. There was an event, an exhibition.
Nach Deutschland Geflüchtete melden sich da zurück.
And many people that have come to Germany as refugees also participated in that exhibition. Of course, there was a lot of misery that I've seen. There were people who died. But then they finally went to Germany or England or elsewhere, and they talked about how important that was. And in 2020, the mood, the general mood changed. There were even pogrom-like moods. But people say, we have solidarity. This is the value we'd like to carry into the future. Hundreds of people who participated in the organizing of that exhibition. And these are the stories we need to talk about. I mean, this constant media coverage, these constant talk shows about migration and negative stories. We need to organize something positive.
Nichts gegen den Oberbürgermeister, sondern man muss in den Kommunen
in the municipalities, we still have so many people who are doing everything they can in order to have a successful integration. And every day they have to listen to that toxic rubbish. We need to organize more fora, more discussions with refugees, with policy makers. We still have mayors who are active and committed, and we need to also invite society. Pro Asyl, our organization, gave an award to the mayor of Ebertshausen, a town in Bavaria. That mayor there has created a wonderful open arms structure together with civil societies. They had wonderful results. He used to be a member of CSU, the Christian Social Union. Now he's no longer a member of that party. But he really made things happen in his municipality. We need to tell these stories. Who have created opportunities in our societies, who have developed projects. We need to talk about the lighthouse projects. It was said several times before, we have a political struggle we have to wage. I mean, I might be 15 years older than you, but we are still all involved in that struggle. And now that things are difficult, we need to work seriously. And of course, today we talk about the fundamentals of our society, the fundamentals that we need to defend in order to defend our open and migration-friendly society. It's worthwhile working for that purpose. Mr. Matzanka. Success stories. I talked about the success stories already. Now I'd like to talk about something else. I think you all know the story, The Emperor's New Clothes, of Christian Andersen. The emperor is naked, but he still pretends to have clothes on. And you can still tell this story. We made one mistake in 2015-16, different from what we did in the early 90s when the Yugoslavian war is, and different from what we did in 2023 when the Ukrainians came. I was involved in all these processes. In 15-16, we had a major difference. Ms. Merkel has consciously decided that people will have an asylum procedure based on the rule of law. Those who get accepted will have a perspective in Germany. Those who cannot be accepted have to leave the country. And the recognition quota was about 50%. This is how you got your Iranian butcher, and this is you have this well-integrated Bosnian refugee family, because the legislator said, and it took until 1890. Now, we have the change in policy, and the courts have confirmed this. In spite of all the offers, people did not return. They did not leave the country after not being accepted. And we send them into the U-boat. That is to say, they get less social benefits, they get less access to employment, and employment is the engine of integration. We do not support them anymore, but we cannot take them back, bring them back to their states of origin because of a lack of reception from these countries, be it Iran or Lebanon or Turkey or whatever. You cannot just send people back to those countries. In Berlin, it's 19,000 people who would have to be deported. If I followed the Trump model, deporting with army airplanes, arrest against the will of the regional police, just done by the National Guard. It would take me 7 years to get all these people out. It cannot succeed. Technically speaking, legally speaking, administratively speaking, it is not possible. The things that are being claimed just don't work. Can you just remember the debate we had about the Syrians, giving them a chance to go to their country and look at what's developing there? Maybe they want to stay after all. Nobody wanted to leave. These people don't want. They cannot go back to Syria. The question is, how much do we invest into that debate about the returns? What I think is more interesting
Was ist in 22, 23 anders gelaufen?
Is to think about what was different in 22, 23. I mean, there, something was different in civil society. In 2016, we had a crisis in the Berlin Office of Healthcare and Social Affairs. 10 employees, they could handle about 500 cases a week, let's say. These 10 employees, they're experts. They can also work extra during the weekend. But all of a sudden, you do not have 500 refugees coming per week, but 700. And the next day, you have 900 coming. And of course, that adds up to the number of cases that don't get handled. And you have the long queue standing there at the office, the Berlin office. You can say, I need more staff, I need more resources, I need more people. I don't get them, so what do? I ask my Minister of the Interior, my Minister of Social Affairs, but those ministers cannot find enough staff, and the queues get longer every day. Then you have the volunteers giving people soup and counseling. In November, December, it's cold, it's dirty, and people stand and cannot send in their application. Of course, there was a lot of criticism in 2015 and 16. What was different in 2022? People did not come through the Balkans anymore. They came through Warsaw. And the turning point was Berlin. And it took us 4 weeks to convince people that it might be a good idea to let the train stop in Brandenburg or in Goslar. But no, all the trains came directly to Berlin. And again, all of these people came, lots of volunteers that went to the airports and received Ukrainians and gave them support. So we needed a solution. The solution was the following one. We said, okay, we do have a crisis no matter what's in the law. The law says you can only get a residence permit if you have your fingerprints, all your details taken, and so on and so forth. We said we don't do it. We developed a digital application. Everyone coming to the central station could file their application right at the train station, submit their passport, get a stamp saying that they have a residence permit and full integration rights. And this is how we handled and gave legal titles to tens of thousands of Ukrainians. Ms. Nahles in 1718 said, well, if we worked more actively, we could have given work to everyone. But now we accelerated the processes. And then I got a phone call from a nurse in a kindergarten. And she asked me, well, I do have a Ukrainian lady who says she's a qualified educator. Can she work? I said, yes, she can work. What happens if the customs came to accuse me of illegal labor? I said, no. She's a teacher. She's an educator. She can teach Ukrainian children according to Ukrainian curricula in Ukrainian. The Poles did it. The Danes did it. We Germans, of course, insisted on having a stamp. I said, and if the customs office comes and says, it's Irina, I employed her as a kitchen aide. I do not know why she sings Ukrainian songs with the children. End of story. We didn't do that. So we didn't do that also. And that's our problem. We are over-regulated, and we Germans love to write and have something in writing. We hate taking decisions. That is our problem, and that's the only problem we have. And in 2022, we changed that, and the story continued. When Berlin did it in a different way, everybody said that's illegal. And we told people, yes, it's against the law, but we have a crisis. Either you confirm what we are doing or you ban it. And this crisis that you're going to have with the queue in front of my office, that will be your crisis. And I'm going to tell the Minister of the Interior, you do whatever you want to come to terms with the crisis. And then we got a letter from the national law that analog applications are all right. And this is how the whole of Germany worked the way we did in Berlin. Last remark, I told a construction worker, you know, in your company, you have 10 apprentices, and every day every month, they do 10 bathrooms. And all of a sudden, you get more people saying, well, we can do 200. I said, well, we can do it differently. I am in charge of Berlin, and I have to make sure that I have as much personnel as possible to come to terms with all the work. And of course, in 2022, we had developed a somewhat random crisis mechanism, and that was the only way to handle things. Bureaucracy, red tape reduction, this is what indeed we need. Maybe one more aspect we also saw during the arrival of Ukrainian refugees. I mean, it was not as easy as you told us for other people coming from Ukraine. I mean, the Ukrainians, they were easily accepted, but students from third countries studying in Ukraine, they were not so readily accepted. They had a lot of difficulties. That's also part of the overall story regarding migration from Ukraine. Can you tell me what time it is? Because we need to take care of our timing. I have one more question. I should have put my glasses on, but I was too vain to do it, so I couldn't read the time on the screen. You said we want to develop perspectives. And we do not have enough time. We have already taken stock of what we have achieved and not achieved. We've also talked about the tension that we have between the isolationist policy and the welcome culture. What do we need in order to be successful today and in the future? What do you think is important from your perspective, not only on the level of discussions, but also on the level of a practical approach, a practical implementation? We need less symbolism in politics. I mean, we have such a symbolist policy when it comes to pushbacks at the borders, and it also concerns the way we provide social support to refugees. Either we give them money or we give them so-called payment cards. They get 50 euro in cash, and the rest is in so-called payment cards. And also civil society starts buying up these checks, these kind of credit cards that you can only use to go shopping in the supermarkets. There we see what we need. We need more humaneness, and humaneness does exist. We need to rely on our humanitarian principles. We need to also understand that people have rights, not because we are so good to accept them and work with people coming to our country, and not just because we want to be a diverse society. Humans have rights. We need to really live the human rights. We do not just need to discuss them. We have rights. We must be clear about our neighbors also having rights. I gave a speech recently and somebody said, you said foreigners have rights. What about the rights of the Germans? And I said, what? Human rights are human rights. We do have rights because we are humans. We need to go back to the culture of human rights practice. Municipalities, I do think we need to support municipal politicians. We will work a lot in practical research programs together with municipalities. And we do have a science network where many municipalities participate. And we had a workshop in Erlangen at our university, and the municipality representatives were so grateful to be able to have a platform for exchange between their neighboring municipalities, because they said, yes, we are in charge of providing housing to refugees, and not only refugees. And they were so interested in an exchange, and many were really tired. And they said, well, nobody wants to listen anymore. Politically, we have the AfD in our city council, and in the administration, the employees say, we don't have time to do all that. We have to do something differently. We cannot allocate all our capacities to the refugee issues. And so these people told us on a municipal level, it's very difficult to make their voice heard. They want to do something good for the refugees, and I think we need to strengthen and support these dedicated politicians and administrators. But as you said, being the mayor and getting criticized and getting really protests, that makes you feel burned out. And that concerns so many frustrated administrators and politicians. I think that is all I wanted to say. I think we could go on, but we have to wind up the discussion. What do you think? What do we need? Mr. Jung. I do think we lack courage and a will to change. What you have described was so impressive, just doing things. And the Germans are so bad at just doing things. It's very difficult for them to just do. They're very conservative, the Germans. There's a lot of angst, a lot of anxiety. So inspiring people who are willing to change, that is very important. And the way you did it, I think, is very impressive. There's so many people everywhere in our towns and villages and cities. They are good. They can do so many things, but they must be given the room to do that. I mean, for you in Berlin, it might be easier than in Goslar. You're too powerful. Mr. Matzanka, maybe one more sentence. What do you think we need more if we want to be successful? I do think
dieser grenzüberschreitenden Erfahrungen, das steht ja auch in Ihrem Titel, und grenzüberschreitend heißt für mich, es braucht mehr Orte, wo Verwaltung mit Wissen
test the boundaries. We also need more spaces where administrators, politicians, and rank-and-file people and scientists work together.
Wir haben viel zu viele
We have too many of these boxes where nobody thinks out of the box, but stays inside his or her own comfort zone. And I think we need to tell more stories like the one about the emperor and his new clothes. Then you will have a realistic perspective, and then you will see changes. Our country needs change, a lot of change, and I do think we can make that happen in a very typical German way. But we have to accelerate processes, and communication is key to acceleration. Mr. Kopp, your last statement. The Berlin example of course, was only possible because there was a political willingness to do it the way you did. Of course, where there's a will, there's a way. That's what they say. And just doing it, I mean, that today we have a discussion about what's legal, what's not so legal. And of course, that has something to do with the national policy, the European policy, and in the US, there also is a very specific approach that they are having nowadays.
Man muss wirklich mit allen Mitteln an der Seite der Betroffenen gegen Rechtsbrüche
really work together with the people whose rights are being violated, neglected, to go back to the rule of law. It was very important at the external borders. Of course, you have people that suffer. Somebody who does not get social benefits anymore. That is not just symbolism. People who need to go to court to have their rights and their dignity restored. We need to work with these people. We have a partner organization in Greece, and together with them, we went to the European Court of Justice regarding the situation at the border, and together with people affected, they won the case in Europe. But let me just add one more thing. After that, the migration minister attacked those organizations because today politicians say you are filing a lawsuit against us and we are going to make sure that we do not give you any money, any resources more. So they're combating such NGO strategic work with people affected. For that purpose, we need donations, we need money. In parallel to that, you also need to be involved in the political process so that civil societies will have a voice, will be heard. That's a political struggle, and it's also a legal struggle. On a legal basis alone, we cannot make it happen, although we do have a lot of success that we achieved in Supreme Courts. But of course, the governments are there. We can also do something to keep these NGOs smaller, and that can lead to more and more oppression. Thank you very much. I think what we can say is that human rights must remain respected. And also sometimes civil disobedience will be required to make sure that human dignity and human rights get preserved. We also need to resist. And when we have such discussions about cityscapes and so on and so forth, it is wonderful to see that people resist, that people take to the streets and say, I am the cityscape. We need more of these people. Rights to have your rights respected, that is important. And
fördert und stärkt. Dazu braucht es Geschichten, aber
here we also need the narratives. We also need the courage to do things and overcome red tape. I would like to thank our guests and wish you a good lunch break.